All right. Hello and welcome to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm joined by Chuck Rogers. And for the next hour, we're going to take a deep dive into national politics. We were kind of concerned because we only did a show a week ago that we wouldn't have much to talk about, but obviously that's never the case. Some things happened last week that are, as you say, ancient history by now. But I'm thinking we ought to start. I think the big thing to start with, even though it's kind of in memory now, is the Atlantic story. You want to give us a little bit of a summary, Chuck?
Well, yeah, that does seem like ancient history since Woodward's book has come out even since then. But yeah, the Atlantic story, I think, on the one hand, we need to remind people that, yes, it relied on anonymous sources, but often, in the business of journalism, especially in Washington, and to some extent in New York, covering finances as well, people have to rely on anonymous sources. That said, the executive editor of The Atlantic is one of the most respected journalists working in Washington and New York. So I tend to give him a lot of credit for at least getting this information, even though he had to rely on anonymous sources. But what I took from that were just the despicable things that Trump had to say about folks who had served in the military, were wounded, even killed. There's even the scene in there where they recount Trump being at Arlington National Cemetery with John Kelly, former general in the Trump administration, whose son was killed overseas while serving this country in uniform, and Trump couldn't understand, well, what was in it for him? Why? And to disparage the military should be completely off limits, as I think any common sense person would say.
I agree. First of all, I want to say that there's nothing wrong with using anonymous sources. You either trust the source using them or you don't. Anonymous sources, I mean, we've seen the movies and the television shows, Lou Grant, when the government wants to prosecute reporters for not revealing their anonymous sources. We know that Watergate, all of those stories were based on an anonymous source. We know that, it is regular. You either trust the source or you don't. And the Atlantic has never, on Snopes or PolitiFact, and I forget what the third one, has never failed a fact check ever. Right. So they've only been doing it for about 10 years or so, but it's it is a renowned publication, and they have no reason to make this up. And if they were going to make it up to do a hit on Trump, they could have gone a lot further than that and done something that was a lot more damaging, although it is pretty damaging because what made it damaging is that he denied saying it. And so then the rest of the media started doing the story, and 3 other news organizations, including Fox News, have corroborated the story with their own sources. Who knows if it's the same ones, but a couple of them cite multiple sources to say that it happened. John Bolton says he doesn't remember it, but also says he wasn't with them the whole time. And so and then they've got some people who are still with Trump who are denying it, but he denied it. And then some of the news organizations started pulling out, well, you said something very similar about John McCain a few years back about him being a loser because he was captured. I don't like people who were captured. So he denied saying that. Well, there's a firm record of that. And so that came out, and I think it really hurt him in Arizona. I think the Republicans did some internal polling and found out that they're not going to do well in Arizona anyway. And at least for the moment, they seem to have packed up and left. They had a major media blitz for the Phoenix, metropolitan area planned, and they just canceled it. Now, they also may have canceled it, and we'll get to the story later, because even though they raised over $1 billion, they're almost broke. So we'll talk about that too. But before we leave the Atlantic, this is this is something that if a Democrat had said any of this kind of stuff, or was even alleged to have said this stuff, the race would be over. There's just no way.
if Trump were a Democrat, he would have been thrown out of office a long time ago. The Republicans would not have put up with any of this, or at least they would have tried to throw him out of office. Yeah, it's so hypocritical. And the other thing about the anonymous sources in the Atlantic, something to keep an eye on, is this. If any of those anonymous sources cited in the Atlantic article are the same sources that appear in the new Bob Woodward book that was just released on the day that we're recording this show,
Right.
Then look for some of those sources to say, well, I have nothing to lose now by identifying myself as being one of the sources from the Atlantic article as well. So that's something to watch for. The other thing is, I agree with you about Trump's history, especially with McCain. I think that's one of the reasons why what the anonymous sources had to say in the Atlantic ring true, because there's a track record of Trump saying things like this about people who did serve in the military. So I think that's why it all rings true, even though the sources in the Atlantic are anonymous.
And I may have forgotten to mention, the reason I brought up Arizona is that's the home state of McCain, and he's still very popular there, even among Republicans. So, and you've got that Senate race that's going, where one poll has Mark Kelly as much as 17 points ahead. Changing demographics, Clinton actually outperformed the polls. She didn't win it, but she did better than what the polls indicated back in 2016, probably because a lot of Latinos, like some working class whites, didn't make it into the likely voter formulas, but they've updated the likely voter formulas, and he's not doing well in those polls. And so I think they've just decided to focus on some other states. But you mentioned the Bob Woodward book. Before we get into that, and what we're going to get into is that there's a whole bunch of things that Trump said. He would even call up Woodward and just kind of unload on him, talk about things. Knowing who Bob Woodward was, why did his people let him talk to him? Why was he talking to Bob Woodward? I mean, that just is insane. Well, Bob Woodward, of course, was one of the two reporters who, with the help of an anonymous source that we all know now, broke open Watergate. I mean, what was he thinking?
Well, I can give you a guess. I've had some experience interviewing people who I was surprised agreed to do the interview. But here's my guess, just based on my experience. One, ego. He wants to be in a book that has Bob Woodward's name on it. And two, his belief, and this relates to ego, but his belief that he can persuade anybody to his point of view. And I think that that's probably it. And that's oversimplified a little, but I believe it's Trump's ego and his believing in that he's the most persuadable person there is. And, the other thing, Woodward famously does ask permission to record his interviews. This is not new. So, and Trump did give permission. And apparently there were 18 of these interviews between December 2019 and July 2020. So what we've heard so far in the excerpts pre-publication is just the tip of the iceberg. Who knows what else is on those recordings? And I'm sure that we will eventually hear.
Well, and I'm also have the feeling that, unlike some of the other reporters at the press conferences, Bob Woodward probably didn't challenge him overtly. He probably.
No, I think you can hear from the recordings that we've heard so far, and again, we've only heard a few of them. Yeah. I think you can hear that Woodward is letting Trump dig his own grave here.
Yeah.
And Woodward is just tossing out a topic, or even sometimes you can even hear Woodward gets only half the question out, and Trump just takes off. And at that point, Woodward just lets him talk. And
I think it was whoever his handlers were at that time, and I don't know exactly when that started. That's political negligence. I mean, even if I'm working for a liberal candidate, I would not want Bob Woodward interviewing, my client in office. There's just nothing to gain there, and a
Well,
lot to lose.
you know what, Eric? That's such a good point. But that once again, just like the things that he said about McCain, make us believe the anonymous sources in the Atlantic. This is another one of those things that fits with his track record. He's not handleable. There is nobody who can rein this guy in. He just goes by his gut, and he is impulsive, and he just does whatever he wants to do and says whatever he wants to say, because he has this belief in himself that he's infallible, that he is a monarch, and that's who he is. And that's why even if there are advisors who warned him against the Woodward interview, and certainly against having it recorded, which gets rid of his plausible deniability because it's on tape,
Yeah.
that it wouldn't have made any difference.
Yeah, he's already denied one thing, I guess, forgetting that it was recorded. I don't think he'll be issuing any more denials. I mean, that's two lies he's caught in a week in terms of denying.
Yeah.
He denied the having slammed McCain. It just, but at what point does this start to have an impact? I don't know. I want to go to, talk a little bit about what this means in terms of the state of the race. But is there anything else you want to say about the Woodward book before we move on?
Well, I can't wait to read some more of the excerpts and hear some more of the tapes. I have a feeling that with 18 interviews, there's going to be a lot that is yet to be released. And I believe as the book rolls out itself, there'll be more and more of the tapes released as well. So I also think that some of this is going to end up in some of the ads that are produced by the Lincoln Project and some of the other Never Trumpers. And given the fact that the Biden campaign and the Lincoln Project have a lot of money right now, and the Trump campaign does not, I think that some of the ads that are going to go up soon all over the country based on some of this reporting are going to be devastating, and the Trump campaign is going to be hard pressed to have any kind of response at all. So I think that that's going to make Trump even more desperate than he already is. So who knows what's going to happen? But
All right, I just want to put out word, because I actually know for a fact, because I've been told by them, that we have some younger viewers who like to watch your shows. So if you're under 40 and you don't know who Bob Woodward was, there's an excellent film called All the President's Men. Bob Woodward looks nothing like Robert Redford, and Carl Bernstein looks nothing like Dustin Hoffman, but it's a great movie. It outlines the whole Deep Throat revelations as they were working for the Washington Post, and it came up with revelations that brought down a presidency back then, and a president who has a lot of very interesting similarities with this president. And
everybody should watch it. It's one of the best journalism movies that there is. It's well done.
Yeah. So, all right. So moving on, I've been kind of waiting for polls because I wanted to see what type of impact the Atlantic article would have. I'm actually kind of convinced that we aren't going to have a whole lot of changes, wild swings, at least not in the national polls, because as we discussed last time, there aren't that many people who haven't made up their mind. There's a few people, and it's really going to be about turnout, getting turnout of the people, who support one candidate or the other, because this country is polarized, and according to CNN, Biden's lead over the past few months is the steadiest one in history. That includes Reagan, who just buried, or since they've been polling anyway, who buried his opposition, Mondale, and Nixon, who buried McGovern in 1972. But even in those, the polls varied. There was actually a brief moment after he selected Ferraro that not Biden, McCain. Mondale was actually ahead by a point or two in the polls. This has been the steadiest one. It's gone up and down a little bit, but right now the RCP average is over 7 points, 7 points and some change average. There are some that have Biden ahead by double digits. There's some outliers. Emerson is actually a good pollster, and they have them only at 2% ahead, but I think it's an outlier. Emerson has also been different on some of the statewide polls being lower. It doesn't mean they're a bad pollster, it just means whatever method they're doing is different from everyone else's. And Rasmussen, is not. I think they are a they play games with their polls to generate the results that they want. They have them at 2%, but everybody else, it's a range of 6 to 12%. Those two bring it down. There's another Republican polling group called Trafalgar, which is way out of line with all the other polls, unless they're secretly right. But but what we have to remember, and everybody says, well, the polls failed in 2016. They didn't fail on the national level.
Right.
As we've discussed, she was ahead by an average of 3 points in the polls. She won by 2 points, well within the margin of errors. And she came within the margin of error in all of the states except Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, the results were out of the margin of error of the polls, and we can talk about why that is. Frankly, I think there's suppression in Wisconsin that accounts for some of it. But
well, and it depends on where the people are. I'm so glad you mentioned the polls. You're spot on right. The national polls in 2016 were pretty much exact. I mean, it was very, very close to what actually happened. But what matters, because of the way that we select presidents, is where the people are. We don't have a national election. We have 50 state elections. And so what matters is not the margin in a big state like California or New York or Illinois. What matters is the fact that that you win the right states that have the right number of electoral votes. Mm-hmm. So I wish that we just had a national popular election and we would be done with it. But that's not how we.
And these elections would be nowhere near as interesting, by the way.
Yeah, that's true. The other thing I want to mention, and to your point, about the polls and whether we're going to see any more changes before we get to November 3rd, I agree with you that there's not going to be much more change in the polls. Yes, and that's because one, there's so few undecideds, as few as 5%. But here's the thing to tack on to that. Voting has already started in a lot of states. A lot of people are already mailing in their ballots, which means that as those ballots get mailed in, there are going to be fewer and fewer and fewer undecideds all over the country as that voting continues. So we may have had 5 to 7% undecided before Labor Day, but now on the 9th of September, when we're recording this, people have already started voting. So common sense tells us there are fewer undecideds now, even than there was a week or two ago. And that's just going to continue. So, yeah, I think we can expect to see very little change in the polls between now and November 3rd.
And the interesting thing is, I recommend people go to Cook's Political Report, and Charlie Cook just wrote an article, came out today or yesterday, that basically says that, people are afraid to say it. Everybody's gun shy because of 2016, but right now the race isn't close. Biden is winning, and nobody wants to say that. Now there's, Trump has a little bit of good news. Some of the polls have closed in a little bit, but probably not statistically speaking. Florida had a poll in which he was dead even, and he seems to have lost some ground there. Apparently, some of Trump's messages about Biden being a socialist is resonating with Cuban Americans. And even though Biden has an advantage with Latinos in general there, Cubans make up about a third of the Latino vote there, and they tend to be more conservative. Not necessarily all Republicans, but tend to be more conservative. So you've got Florida as an outlier. However, Biden is doing much better among elderly in Florida, probably because of the pandemic issue and how it's been handled. Than Clinton did. So it's a mixed bag there. That's a toss-up right now. But I think what's going to happen is Trump is pulling in his money from Arizona. That means he has to start spending money in Michigan again, and he's going to do that, and he's going to, quote unquote, go on offense in Minnesota, which was really close in 2016. Clinton carried it, but people are like saying it's not going to happen this time around. It's not going to be that close, even though Minnesota has become a bit redder over the years. And he's took a trip to New Hampshire, but nobody really takes that seriously. They think that's bravado, that he is going to be focusing on 4 states to try to keep it. He has to, if he can lose Michigan and Arizona, but he's got to win everything else, and that means he's got to win in Wisconsin, everything else that he won in 2016. He can't lose any of it. That means he's going to focus in 4 states: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida. He's going to work really hard on those states. Now, I think he's got to be a little bit careful, because I think he also has to watch it, although I think he'll win it if he puts it, but he's going to have to dedicate some effort to winning Texas, because those polls are really close. Even a couple polls had Biden ahead. I don't believe that, but it's that close. Georgia, which is a little bit up in the air, I would still give it a lean Trump, but only a lean Trump. More than a tilt, but definitely a lean. And he also cannot lose Iowa, and things have gotten closer in Iowa and Ohio, which has a lot of the same demographics. And Biden is ahead by about a 1 or 2 points average in Ohio. So he's got to reverse those. He's got to hold on to those 4, and he's got to hold on actually to all 8. There's really no offense that he can speak of other than Minnesota and New Hampshire. He doesn't seem to have much of a chance in Virginia. He doesn't have much of a chance in Colorado. And quite frankly, it's conceivable he could even lose Montana. Not likely, but conceivable.
Yeah, I agree. A couple of things to point out. One, you mentioned Ohio, and I think you're right that he is going to have to find some money to spend in Ohio. The reason I say that, and the reason that's on my mind, this morning I was reading a transcript of an interview with Sherrod Brown, who's a U.S. Senator from Ohio, who is he's kind of a straight shooter. He tells you exactly like it is. He was not saying that Biden will win Ohio, but he was much more optimistic today than he has been in a long time. So he's seeing something in Ohio that's happening there. So that's going to force Trump, if Sherrod Brown is right, to spend some resources, including money and time, in Ohio that I don't think he thought he was going to have to spend prior to right now. Same goes for Texas. And I also want to circle back to your comments on Florida. There's a great reporter for the Miami Herald who spends a lot of time in Tallahassee covering state issues in Florida, but also is a statewide political reporter. And one of the things he said just today is having to do with that poll that you referenced that showed 48 to 48 a tie, with only a couple of percentage points of undecided there. His view was that the Cuban American population in Miami-Dade was a little bit overrepresented in that poll because he dug into the methodology. And so while he does not dispute that it's a very close race in Florida, as usual, he's not sure it's tied. And he looks at the, as you mentioned also, the over 65 population in Florida, which is significant. He thinks that might have been a little underrepresented in the poll. So his view is that it might be closer to, say, 50 to 46 or 49, 47, something like that. He's not saying that it's not close, but he's also optimistic about Florida. So if Biden wins Florida and Arizona and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Minnesota, it's a landslide at that point.
Yeah, and of course, if he wins the Rust Belt, he doesn't even need Florida or Arizona or North Carolina.
Right.
And he could lose a bunch of the Sun Belt, but if he wins Florida and Arizona, he's also won it. I mean, if he loses the Rust Belt.
There are a lot of pathways for Uncle Joe. There aren't very many pathways at all for Trump.
It's really narrow.
Trump has to draw a royal flush this time around, whereas Biden has a number of different hands he can cobble together to still win this. And I would not at all be surprised to see Biden win Arizona, especially after the Atlantic article and the Bob Woodward book. I just think that everything that all of those folks remember that Trump said about John McCain and now about military service in general is going to resonate with them.
And he's got to spend some money in Texas because there's no scenario where he wins if he loses Texas. That's just,
no,
can't happen.
No, and those are expensive media markets. He's got to buy in Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, and San Antonio, and El Paso. And not only that, here's the other thing about Texas, and people in California will relate to this. You're talking about a massive geographical area. So yes, you can buy a lot of ads to cover the state of Texas, but you also have to be there. And that means that you've got to travel from El Paso to Houston and from Houston up to Amarillo and from Lubbock across to Dallas. I mean, you have a lot of territory, not even to mention going all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley to talk with folks in Brownsville and McAllen and Laredo and so on. It is a massive undertaking to run statewide in Texas, just like it is here in California.
Yeah.
And if he has to take that kind of time and spend that kind of money on the state of Texas, then I mean, that's a red flag right there that things are not going well.
And again, I want to go back to Charlie Cook because his political report is gold standard. It's renowned, and he's saying everybody's being wimps. You're all afraid because of what happened in 2016. If 2016 had happened, a lot of you would be calling this election already. This is, yes, maybe there can be some October surprise, or yes, maybe things can happen with the post office or with, getting the vote out or some other calamity there when they can't cross the boats. But Biden is winning, and nobody wants to say that.
Well, you don't want to jinx it, you don't want to get overconfident.
I know, that's right. So I want to get back because we're talking about how much money Trump has to spend. And he raised more money than Biden, although Biden had an all-time record-breaking of fundraising in August. I mean, something ridiculous, like over 300 million. 364, and Trump in that same one raised a lot of money, but it was more like 240 million or something like that. I mean, ridiculous amounts of money going to these things. We don't need them, and it's just going to be a barrage of advertisements and the rest. But that's what's happening. But Trump had a reserve of a little bit over $1 billion, I think 1.1 billion, and he's blown through 800 million of it. And a lot of it is maybe, when you're kind of corrupt, you attract kind of corrupt people. I mean, the former campaign manager had a private car and, a bunch of things like that. And there are a lot of sweetheart deals going to, money being spent towards people and the rest. And the problem with that is, if that word gets out about that, people aren't going to want to give you money.
No, and also, a couple other things. Apparently, some of that money has been used for his own personal legal fees and the legal fees of people in his family who have lawsuits coming from all different directions, as we know. The other thing gets back to Trump's ego and his vanity. He convinced people to spend a lot of money producing and buying ads for the Super Bowl earlier this year because he saw fellow New York billionaire Mike Bloomberg advertising on the Super Bowl. And so Trump said, well, we have to spend a lot of money on the Super Bowl. And who remembers any of that at this point? That's very expensive. So a lot of the money was blown early on, and it's all gone. And at this point, with the kind of publicity that's coming out about him and his campaign and his family and all of the corruption, and all of the people who in his circle who are either in prison or waiting to go, those donors are going to run for the hills. In fact, it wouldn't be unusual if some of them donated to Biden. So we'll see what happens. But yeah,
we'll see, because that is really not good. And what has it accomplished? Nothing, didn't move the polls at all. All that
No.
ads, and they've spent a lot of money on ads, and their PACs have spent a lot of money on ads. The question is, what does Trump do to turn this around? The law and order message apparently flopped. I mean, there was a big story about Portland because of course, he sent the troops into Portland. All it did was make things worse. And then, but it turns out there are people in Portland saying, it's bad, but it's all within like a 2 or 3 block radius downtown around the government buildings. Most of the rest of Portland are living perfectly happy lives. The only time it got spread out was when the Yahoos drove in with 600 vehicles a couple weekends ago and caused problems that led to one guy getting shot and killed, and then the suspect strangely being shot later. A lot of weird stuff going on there. But the point is that that spread it out a little bit. But other than that, it's not something that most Portland people even know about if they aren't watching media. And yet it's being portrayed as this dystopian nightmare, where the whole city is in flames and in rubble, and it's just not the case. It's a problem downtown. It would suck if you have a business down in that 2 or 3 block radius, and the rest. It sucks if you're a government employee and you got to deal with this every morning and hope that your car doesn't get busted because they think your car is owned by something else. I don't want to downplay what's happening there. There's been some serious violence and a lot of arrests, but it's the same couple of hundred people at this point going out every night and and doing this dance with the police, and it's really not something that most people in the city think about.
Right. Yeah, I think what that gets to, it gets to the inability and the incapacity of Donald Trump to expand his base at all. He only knows how to attack and divide and criticize and spew anger and hate. That's who the guy is. He's been showing us who he is since the 1970s and 80s, actually, but certainly since he got into politics. That's who he is. He's not a big tent welcoming kind of tolerant person. He is a my way or the highway kind of person, period. That's who he is. That's why he only knows how to attack and divide.
Yeah.
And he's paying for it right now. He's paying for it right now. And it makes me wonder what some of the discussions are this evening as we're recording this among Republican senatorial candidates around the country who woke up this morning to, a Bob Woodward book without anonymous sources. In fact, with the president himself on tape.
Saying it.
And those Republican senatorial candidates are going to get questions about that in their home states. And they're going to have to decide whether they're going to still stay on this bus or not.
Yeah, well, as I said, apparently, and according to all the polling and the rest, the law and order angle of I'm going to restore order to these democratically run cities and the rest, that has not resonated. It is not. It's whipped up his base, but it hasn't impressed anybody else. He went the other morning trying to brag about the economy, and there are people who are doing quite well in this economy. They tend to be the wealthy, but there's about half the country are suffering some serious economic pain. People are starting to get evicted. People are starting, things are starting to happen, and they've got a problem, and we still don't have an agreement in Congress. And although the Senate passed something, it's far from adequate as far as the Democrats are concerned. Schumer and Pelosi said it's DOI or DOA, sorry, on arrival, and so it's yeah. So what does Trump have to talk about? I mean, he doesn't have a platform,
Nope.
to brag about. Doesn't have, he says he built the wall. Or that he's built some of it. I guess he's going to go down and do more photo ops of that, but that's only his base cares about that right now. Right now, immigration is down this year, both legal and illegal, because because of the COVID.
Yeah.
People don't want to come here right now. I mean, it's the 2019 actually had one of the highest rates of arrest of undocumented people crossing the border. And that only accounts for the arrest. That doesn't account for the people who get through and don't turn themselves in anymore because of zero tolerance. So what has he got to brag about there? It's a question of what do they support? All he can do is attack the Democrats as socialists, as as Marxists. And actually, I'm not going to name him, but there's a local political figure I debate often on Facebook. That's all he's got. Antifa, as he says it, Antifa, and Marxists on the street, and Democratic mayors, and Biden touches people inappropriately and has dementia, and it's just the same thing over and over again. But that hasn't worked in the past 3 or 4 months. What do you think is going to work? Quite frankly, even I think if they do rush a vaccine and it works out great, I don't think that's going to save them, because I think there are people who will vote for him. A lot of people, even if the economy was to magically improve by then for everybody, I think people are done with the shtick. And that's going to be something hard to overcome. He's got that strong base that doesn't seem to be cutting into it. Except one last thing, and I'll give it back to you. There is an interesting trend here, is that he has been losing white working class voters, and that's why he's losing in the Rust Belt. He's staying kind of steady with his the supporters among people of color, which wasn't much, but what he had, he's holding on to, and with college-educated white people that were his support. He's got the minority of both of those, but he hasn't lost a lot of support in those categories. Probably the latter because of the tax breaks. Probably the former because they are part of the evangelical communities that think this guy is is working for God, even if he doesn't know it. But white working class people who either voted for him or didn't vote because they, for whatever reason, they just couldn't get behind Clinton, appear to be moving towards Biden. That's what will probably take the Rust Belt for him.
Well, I think you're right, and I think we have some evidence of that today, as a matter of fact. And again, this is September the 9th when we're recording this, but just today, Joe Biden was in Warren, Michigan, right outside of Detroit, speaking to UAW members and talking about the value of unions and the strength of unions and the working class. And so I think that tells us a lot. One, it tells us that what we know, let me put it this way. What we know is he would not have done that had they not seen some opportunity for that. To get some traction there. So I think that what Biden is doing confirms exactly what you're talking about, that some of the working class is slipping away from Trump and is at least toying with the idea of going back to the Democratic Party. I think that we can assume that's one reason Biden was in the Detroit area just today. As far as the vaccine goes, which you mentioned, I think this is very interesting. A lot of people have assumed that the October surprise from the Republican side was going to be a vaccine in late October at some point, and that Trump would be able to, tout this as, him coming to the rescue. But what we know is that at least one of the pharmaceutical companies involved in research, I believe it was AstraZeneca today,
had to stop.
Announced that they had some problems with their tests, and they were stopping and going back and trying to retool what they had done. So, and also, we've also seen the Surgeon General and a couple of other folks, including some people in the Department of Homeland Security, interestingly enough, as well as some physicians who have been advisors, saying that they are pledging not to roll out a vaccine before they're confident that it's ready, which only makes sense because that's the last mistake you want to make, because you're not going to get people's trust back if you do it wrong to start with, especially if people end up with some of the horrific side effects that can affect people for life if you make a mistake on this. So the liability alone of being wrong on this is going to halt some of the scientists and pharmaceutical companies from going along with Trump just to bolster Donald Trump. So I don't know how that's going to roll out. We just don't know yet. But I think there's some question as to whether they're going to be able to use that as the October surprise as of right now. We'll see.
I just don't think. I think even if they were to pull it off, which is unlikely, even if he was to rush things and to be able to somehow frame it as a good thing that we didn't have to go through all the same process, whatever, we've got something. I don't think that's going to be enough at this point. I think the only thing that could happen is if he could tag Biden with some kind of corruption, and that means that report has got to do well. And we're talking about here, Barr involved in it. Apparently, Barr is stepping in literally as his private attorneys now. Maybe because they're running out of money. I don't know. And people are in shock about that. About they're defending him in a defamation case. I mean, it's bizarre. But they're doing it, and it's outright, and the Republicans dead silence about it in the Senate. I mean, that's impeachable right there. I mean, it's just.
And can I ask you something about that as an attorney? Bill Barr is arguing that if a president says it, it is therefore having to do with his office of the presidency. And the office of the presidency cannot be sued for defamation. But clearly the case at bar is this woman in New York who is claiming defamation because of what he said about her, about something that doesn't have anything to do with the office of the presidency. So what are people in the legal field saying about what Bill Barr is doing here?
My senior partner who brought me up to Humboldt County passed away last Friday. His name was Les Scher. Great attorney. People know him well in Southern Humboldt. He brought music of all kinds to Southern Humboldt. He is an attorney who one time tried to win a case. It was a case of a woman who was a nun who was used to driving on the other side of the road. And so she was driving to some family or something like that, and she caused an accident, a head-on accident, because she was driving on the wrong side of the road. And the defense, so they sued the church because she doesn't have a lot of money, right? It caused a lot of injury. The church argued, well, she wasn't on the clock when she did it, and she was, therefore the church isn't responsible. Les attempted to bring in a theologian from Berkeley to argue that because a nun has to be prayerful all the time, that she's always on the clock because she's always representing God. But Les, and when he was telling me the story, he says, but Les, being Jewish himself, said, but the sellout Jewish judge says you're just going to have to take that to the appellate court. So the idea that no matter what he does, he's on the clock all the time, and he's acting in accordance with the president. Boy, I mean, we could probably think about millions of times where the Department of Justice would be defending presidents all the time, including Clinton, right? Yeah. Clinton was being sued. He had to do depositions. It should have been the DOJ doing that. It's unprecedented. And his supporters are going to say, oh, what a, original thinking maverick, and the Senate Republicans are just going to look the other way. They're not going to say anything about it. They're just going to look the other way. There's nothing to be done. So there's certainly nothing to be done anyway. It'd be too late for any type of hearing. But it is absolute corruption. I mean, it's just unadulterated. And I think it's because he's running out of money, and he can't afford to have so many lawyers anymore.
Right. One more question, and that has to do a little bit with that. So we have Trump and Barr kind of in cahoots here, just kind of taking the Department of Justice for their own. So that's one thing. But we also have all of these damning things that are coming out in one book after another, including people from his own family saying things about him that are not flattering, to say the very least. And the Republicans, as you indicate, remaining silent. Literally almost all of them. A few have spoken out, but the ones who are still in Washington are mostly remaining silent.
Yeah.
At what point do they begin to realize that their legacy is going to be tied to this?
I think they've
And
given up on their
all
legacy.
what they've done before is going to be completely erased by their enabling of this guy. When are they
Yeah.
going to realize that?
I think they've given up on their legacy. I think they're hoping they can somehow defend it later, by saying, well, we were trying to work with them, blah, blah, blah. But I think they've given up on that. I think it's all about the power of the moment. And that's their sole interest. They're not saying anything about the Atlantic article. They're running from it.
Right.
It's just, no, I think they're just, and although McConnell has basically told all of the Senate candidates, you don't have to defend Trump if you don't want to. If you're in a tough race, just do every person for themselves. And I think some of them are doing that. I don't see a lot of Senate candidates joining them up on his stages.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's so short-sighted. It's mind-boggling how short-sighted it is. It just defies common sense. And it also seems to me that it is just blatantly, right out in the open, putting party before country.
Mhm.
That should be something that the right wing notices, wouldn't you think?
You would think. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's absolute corruption, and there's just no way of doing it. We learned this in January when they shut down the impeachment proceeding, wouldn't allow new evidence to be entered, and
Witnesses, nothing.
yeah, and voted on almost a party line against it.
Right.
So it's just it's the way it is. It's the state right now, and that's what a lot of people are hoping will come to an end in January. And of course we haven't talked a lot about it. What happens if Trump does lose? What happens between November and January? Anyway, we've got a lot to think about that, but we first have to think about the election. I don't know. There's a lot more news out there. There's things we haven't covered. More Republicans endorsing Biden, in the news, and things like that. We have, as you mentioned, Biden was in Michigan today. He's going to be in Florida a couple of days. Harris is in Florida tomorrow, I believe. So they're starting to kick their stuff off. The question is, what is their campaign going to look like? They're not going to hold big rallies. They're going to respect the science about the pandemic, so they're going to be very careful about it. But he does have to make trips to the cities. He's got to get on the local news. People saying, and he showed up in the Warren, Pennsylvania, right outside Detroit. He needs that coverage. I think the time for sitting back and letting Trump hang himself, that's over. That was then. But he's got to now sell his campaign and explain exactly what he's going to do. He's got to now make it about policy and not just about Trump, because Trump's got nothing policy-wise. They're not offering anything.
I have been impressed over the last few days, just to follow up on that, about how Biden and Harris are approaching this, and I think they're doing it the right way. If you notice some of the travel and gatherings where they have been, I'm thinking today, Kamala Harris, for example, was speaking to a group of people who were, distanced, and she was a fair distance away from them also. So you can tell that they're aware and they're trying to do the right thing. And I think that's what counts. And in Joe Biden's stop today outside of Detroit, it was the same thing. There were people there, but they were back and they were distanced. And, as Biden and Harris arrive at places, they are wearing masks, and they, sometimes speak with the mask on. Sometimes if people are far enough away, they'll take it off. But it's clear at these events, they are trying to do the right thing. I think that that's what counts,
Right.
As opposed to Trump, who made a stop in North Carolina. I believe it was Sunday. It might have been Labor Day Monday, where people were crammed in. Very few, except for the ones who were on camera right behind him, very few wearing masks. And again, people just shoulder to shoulder. The Trump entourage, of course, not wearing masks at all. So there's a real contrast there. But I think Harris and Biden are trying to do things the right way, and it shows.
Yes, no, that's definitely the truth. And but one of the disadvantages is that Republicans have actually been outpacing Democrats in registering voters because Republicans are going door to door, and Democrats don't want to do that. They've got to come up with another model for getting people registered, getting students registered, wherever they're at, and they got to figure that one out because that is one way they could lose is if they don't get the turnout of all the people who support them.
Well, yeah, like in real estate, it's location, location, location. In politics, it's turnout, turnout, turnout. So the Democrats need to get that right.
Absolutely. I think one of the other things I wanted to note about the polls, going back to them, normally when you see a polls, you've got two polls. Sometimes they do registered voters and of likely voters. They separate the likely voters from the registered voters. And for some reason, normally it's the Democrats do better with just the registered voters as opposed to the likely voters. It's been a little bit reversed in a couple of polls, and I'm wondering what the story is there.
Well, I think Democrats are energized in this election for a couple of reasons. One, I think people were completely surprised by the result in 2016, and they don't want to be surprised again. So I think that has helped in the registration and the motivation on the Democratic side. But I think the more Trump speaks, the more motivated the Democrats get. So I think that Trump's politics of fear has to some extent motivated and held his base. But I think the politics of fear from Trump has really motivated the left, saying we cannot have this guy for another 4 years. We cannot allow this to happen for another 4 years. So I think that Trump himself has motivated the left.
All right. And Chuck, that brings us to our predictions. So we're at the end of the show here. Do you have any predictions you want to share?
I do. I was thinking about this last night and was doing some reading on it, and it dawned on me that we have debates coming up, presidential debates and a vice presidential debate. The first presidential debate is this month, it's September the 29th. My prediction is that Donald Trump is just going to wing it, pretty much the same way he did with the Bob Woodward interviews, because he thinks in his own mind that he's infallible and he's the most persuasive person that maybe there ever has been, which is, kind of the way he talks about himself in a monarchical kind of way and a nobility kind of way. So I have a feeling that Trump is not going to be prepared for the debates at all. He's just going to wing it. And again, that's September the 29th. The debates are September 29th, October 15th, and October 22nd. The vice presidential debate, which I am not going to miss, is going to be October the 7th. So I think you'll see Pence being more prepared for his debate than Trump, but I predict Trump's just going to wing it.
All right. I'm going to also make my prediction about the debates. I'll be real quick about this. I think that the Trump campaign has made a serious mistake. I noticed they don't say Sleepy Joe much anymore. I think they aren't pushing the dementia as much, even if their surrogates are. I think that has been a big mistake because what they've done is lowered the expectations of Biden's performance. Biden just has to pass. He just has to get through it, and he'll look brilliant, just like he did with the speech, his acceptance speech. Everybody all of a sudden was surprised. Oh, he got through it. He kept straight thoughts, and unlike Trump, he wasn't even reading it all from the teleprompter. He had some things that he added in, and so I think that that's going to be a factor that helps Biden in the debates. And then the big question is, what is the October surprise? Because I don't think the debates will turn around for Trump.
Right. I agree. Yeah. What is the October surprise? We'll see.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chuck. We've reached the end of the show again. I want to thank you. I want to thank Matt Knight for engineering this, and we'll be back in 2 weeks.